The morning Sylvie Marchand arrived in Coldwater Flats, she owned exactly two things worth keeping: a wool coat that had belonged to her mother, and a letter she'd read so many times the fold lines had gone white. The letter was from a man named Gideon Holt. It was 11 lines long. It said he had a working ranch outside of Coldwater Flats in the Alberta foothills, that he had a daughter of 9 who needed tending, that he could offer room and board and a fair wage and a legal arrangement if she was willing, and that he was not a man given to pretense, so he would say plainly that the ranch was struggling, and she should know that before she made any decisions. He signed it G. Holt, nothing more. Sylvie had read warmer letters from bill collectors, but she'd also just spent 4 months sleeping on her cousin Marguerite's kitchen floor in Lethbridge, after the fire took what was left of her family's farm, and Marguerite's husband had started making comments about how long a woman could reasonably expect someone else's charity to last. So Sylvie had written back to G. Holt, packed her coat and her few remaining things into a canvas bag, and taken the stage west into the foothills. She was 29 years old. Every one of those years showed, she thought, in the way she'd stopped flinching at hard news. The stage left her at a crossroads with a general store, a church listing slightly to the left, and a livery that smelled powerfully of horse. A boy of about 12 was leaning against the hitching post, chewing on something. "You the woman for the Holt place?" he asked. "I am," Mr. Holt's wagon's around back. "He said to tell you he's loading feed and won't be long." The boy looked her over with the frank assessment of children who haven't learned to hide it yet. "You look smaller than I thought." "Most things do," Sylvie said, "until you're standing next to them." The boy considered this and went back to his chewing. The wagon was a flatbed, practical and unadorned, hitched to a pair of gray horses that were better kept than the wagon itself. Gideon Holt was heaving sacks of oats into the bed when she came around the corner, and he didn't notice her for a moment, which gave her the chance to look at him honestly. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with dark hair going gray at the temples and a jaw set like he'd decided something a long time ago and hadn't changed his mind since. His hands were the hands of a man who worked, scarred across the knuckles, rope-roughened. There was a stillness to him that wasn't quite calm, more like a man who'd learned to stop wasting motion. He lifted the last sack, straightened, and saw her. "Not a question, Mr. Holt." He looked at her the way she'd looked at him. Direct, not unkind, but not warm either. "Stage was early. 20 minutes. I'm nearly done. You can put your bag in the cab." He turned back to securing the load. That was the entirety of their introduction. The drive to the ranch took the better part of an hour through country that opened up wide and cold and beautiful the further they got from town. The foothills rising blue and distant against a sky that seemed too large to be real. Gideon drove without talking. Sylvie watched the land and didn't push conversation. After maybe 30 minutes, he spoke. "My daughter's name is Patience. She's 9. She doesn't always answer to Patience. She's taken to calling herself Pat, which I'm told is not a name for a girl. You'll call her what she wants to be called. It's not worth the argument. All right. She knows you're coming. Didn't take it well at first." He paused. "She'll come around if you're straight with her. She doesn't like people who talk around things." "Neither do I." He glanced at her, just briefly, then looked back at the road. "I should tell you the arrangement I'm offering is exactly what I wrote. I don't have intentions beyond the practical. My wife passed 3 years ago. I'm not looking to replace her." "I'm not trying to be replaced," Sylvie said. "I needed work. You advertised for it." A pause. "Good." The ranch appeared as they came over a rise, a main house, a barn, a scattering of outbuildings, all weathered the same silvery gray of wood that had taken years of Alberta winters without enough attention. Fences ran out in uneven lines. She could count maybe 30 cattle grazing on the far side of the valley. Everything looked tired in the way of something that had been trying too hard for too long. A small figure was standing on the porch. Pat Holt had her father's dark hair and her father's watchful stillness, and she looked at Sylvie with the expression of a person who has decided not to be impressed. "That her?" Pat said to her father. "That's her." Gideon pulled the brake. "This is Miss Marchand. You can call me Sylvie," Sylvie said. Pat looked her over. "You're not as old as I thought you'd be. How old did you think I'd be old?" Pat shrugged. "Mrs. Keating from the church is who Papa usually gets to help, and she smells like lavender and talks too slow. Papa said you weren't from here. I'm from east of Lethbridge. Is that nicer than here?" "It's flatter," Sylvie said. "I like the hills better." Pat chewed on this. "Then supper's cold. I tried to keep it warm, but the fire went low." "Show me the stove," Sylvie said. "We'll fix it." That was how she and Pat began. Not warmly but honestly, which Sylvie had learned was a better foundation anyway. The house was spare. Clean enough but spare. No curtains, no rugs, the furniture solid and functional and showing its age. A shelf of books stood in the parlor, well read by the look of the spines. The kitchen was the warmest room, and Sylvie spent the first hour learning its logic, where Gideon kept the good matches, where the flour sat, which burner on the stove ran hot. That night at the table, the three of them ate cold potato soup that Sylvie had managed to warm up, and bread that was 2 days old and better for toasting. Pat ate with purpose. Gideon ate without commenting on the food, which Sylvie decided to take as a compliment. "There's a list of what needs doing," Gideon said when the plates were cleared. "On the desk in the parlor. It's a long list. I'd expect so. I don't require conversation at meals. I don't require much conversation generally. If you need something, you can say so directly. I won't be offended." Sylvie studied him across the table. "And what do you need from me that you can't say directly?" He looked up at her. Something moved behind his expression. Surprise maybe, quickly controlled. "I need someone Pat will trust. That matters more than the cooking and the cleaning, though those matter too." "Why doesn't she trust anyone?" A long pause. "Her mother died after a long illness. Pat watched it happen in stages." "She doesn't?" "She stopped letting people close when she understood how fast you can lose them." He said it flat, the way people say things they've said to themselves too many times. "I've not done a good job of teaching her otherwise. I haven't been much of an example." Sylvie thought about her mother's wool coat hanging on the hook by the door, about how long she'd been carrying it before she admitted she was carrying it to hold on to something she'd already lost. "I understand that," she said, "more than you might think." Gideon looked at her, really looked, the way he hadn't since she'd arrived. Then he nodded once and pushed back from the table. "I'll be up before dawn. Don't trouble yourself to start breakfast before 6. He left. Pat was still at the table, watching Sylvie with those quiet dark eyes. "He doesn't talk about Mama to people," Pat said. "I know. Why'd he tell you?" Sylvie thought about it honestly. "Maybe because I wasn't going to pretend I understood if I didn't, and he could tell that." Pat was quiet for a moment. "She used to make biscuits on Sunday. Papa tried once after she died. They were terrible." She said it without cruelty, just fact. He ate them all anyway. Sylvie felt something press at the back of her throat that she hadn't expected. She swallowed it back down. "I make decent biscuits," she said. "Sunday we'll see if I'm right." The days fell into rhythm. She woke before 6, got the stove going, had breakfast ready when Gideon came in from the first round of morning chores. He ate, said what needed doing on the ranch that day, and went out. She cleaned, cooked, kept the house, and in the afternoons she walked the property while Pat was doing her school lessons. The ranch was in worse shape than it looked from the road. Closer up, you could see where maintenance had slipped. Fence posts rotting at the base, a section of barn roof with a gap in it that had let water in over a whole winter, a drainage ditch along the north pasture that had silted up and was flooding the grazing in wet weather. Manageable problems, most of them, but they added up. Sylvie started keeping a list of her own, ordered by what would hurt the herd first. On the 4th day, she put it on the kitchen table at breakfast. Gideon looked at it for a long time without speaking. "The drainage ditch is the most urgent," she said. "If the north pasture floods again in spring, you'll lose grazing on your best third of the land. I know about the ditch." His voice was careful. "Do you have the materials for it?" "I have most of them." A pause. "I don't have the time. I can help clear it." He looked up from the list. "That's not what I'm paying you for. You're paying me to keep the ranch from falling over while you manage what you can alone. That's what I understood the job to be." He was quiet for a moment. Pat, who was pretending to do something at the counter, had gone very still. "All right," Gideon said finally. Saturday. She found out on the Saturday, while they were working the ditch together, why he didn't have enough time. He'd been managing the whole ranch, cattle, fences, equipment, accounts, everything. Alone for 3 years, not just since hiring her. Before that, he'd had a hand named Orville who'd left when his own place 2 valleys over needed him. Before Orville, 2 others, one who'd moved north to the Peace River country, and one whose name Gideon didn't say. "So for 3 years," Sylvie said, pulling a shovel of silt, "you've been running 300 acres by yourself. Pat helps what she can. She's 9, she's capable." Sylvie looked at him across the ditch. His face was closed off, but there was something in his jaw, the tight set she was starting to recognize as effort that was costing more than he'd admit. "You're not falling behind because you're not capable," she said. "You're falling behind because one person can't do the work of 3. He drove the shovel in hard. "I'm aware of that, then why haven't you hired anyone?" A long silence. Only the sound of work. "Because the last time I hired someone, he stayed 6 months and left with 2 of my best breeding heifers," Gideon said. "Said he was owed back wages. He wasn't. But proving it would have cost more than the heifers were worth, and I had Pat and no time for lawyers." He didn't look at her. "I don't trust easily. I should have said that in the letter. You said the ranch was struggling. I said that. Same thing, more or less. You wouldn't have said it if you weren't warning me." She pulled another shovel. I'm not here to take anything, Holt. I had nothing to take anything with even if I wanted to. He didn't answer right away. But some of the rigid tension in his shoulders eased, just slightly. Like a door, she thought, that had been stuck from disuse and someone had finally put their shoulder to it properly. 3 weeks in, Sylvie found the ledger. She was looking for string in the desk drawer. The household accounts were sitting open where she'd been going through supply orders, and there was a second ledger wedged behind the first, older, the covers worn soft. She pulled it out and opened it without thinking. Ranch finances going back 4 years. The first year, 2 years before his wife died, was steady, even healthy. Decent cattle prices, costs held down, a note about a buyer in Calgary who'd been reliable for 3 seasons. Then the second year, costs started climbing. Feed orders that seemed high for the herd size. Equipment repairs billed at rates that made her slow down and read again. A land survey that cost twice what surveys cost, charged by a company she didn't recognize. She turned to the notes margin. One name came up again and again, D. Schofield. Arrangements via D. Schofield. Contract renegotiated per D. Schofield recommendation. Supply order through D. Schofield contact. Sylvie sat with the ledger in her lap for a long time. That evening at supper, she said carefully, "Who is Schofield?" Gideon's fork stopped moving. D. Schofield, she said. The name's in the old ledger. He set down his fork. Pat, reading a book at the table because she'd eaten fast, looked up at the change in the air. "Douglas Schofield," Gideon said. "He runs a trading company out of Pincher Creek. His father and my father did business together. He helped manage supply contracts and buyer relationships after Meredith got sick, when I was spending time at home instead of at markets. He had connections I didn't." He paused. "Why? The costs don't add up," she said simply. "The feed orders are too high for 30 head, and the survey cost is nearly double what the county surveyor charges. I can show you." Gideon didn't say anything for a long moment. Pat put down her book. "Show me," he said. They sat at the kitchen table after Pat had gone to bed, the two ledgers open between them, and Sylvie walked him through it. The inflated figures, the contracts that had fallen through at critical moments, the pattern she could see when you laid 3 years of entries end to end. How every transaction that went through Douglas Schofield's hands had cost the ranch money in ways that could each be explained away individually. A bad season, an honest supplier raising prices. A buyer who'd found a better option, bad luck. But stacked up, year after year, it wasn't bad luck. Gideon stared at the pages without speaking. His face had gone very still in the way she'd come to understand was not calm at all, but something being held down hard. "He was at Meredith's funeral," he said finally. "He brought food. He sat with Pat he sat with her." He stopped. "I trusted him." Sylvie thought of Thomas's brother showing up with a sheaf of papers the week after the funeral. The way trust could be a door left unlocked for exactly the wrong person. "I know," she said. "You can't know. No. But I know what it's like to have someone use your grief as a map to what you'd stopped watching over." She met his eyes. "I'm not saying he's certain. I'm saying the numbers are saying something worth listening to." Gideon looked at the ledger for a long time. Then, "What do you want to do about it?" "I want to write to that Calgary buyer, the one in the notes from 4 years ago. See if he's heard from Schofield, or if Schofield's the reason he stopped buying from you." Gideon was quiet. "I want to keep doing it quietly," she said. "Don't let Schofield know we're looking. You're asking me to act like I don't know. I'm asking you to be patient long enough to be certain." He rubbed a hand over his face. Outside, the wind had come up, and the house moved slightly the way old houses do in Alberta gales, a familiar settling. Pat's door was closed upstairs. "I don't like this," he said. "I know, but you're right." He said it like it cost him something. "Go ahead and write the letter." Things shifted after that. Not visibly. Sylvie was careful about that, keeping the mornings ordinary, keeping supper the same, giving Schofield nothing if he came around. And he did come around, about a week later, riding up to the house on a horse better than anything in Gideon's barn. Douglas Schofield was the kind of man who walked into a room and immediately established that he'd been there before and knew it better than you did. He was maybe 50, well-fed, with a handshake that went on slightly too long, and eyes that were busy even when his face was pleasant. "Gideon." He clapped Gideon's arm. "I heard you'd hired on some help. Good, good. You've been carrying too much alone." His gaze slid to Sylvie with a kind of assessment that was professional but not comfortable. "Miss Marchand, is it? Holt's lucky to have someone with experience." "I manage," Sylvie said. "The ranch needs it." Schofield said it gently, sorrowfully, the way you say something about an old dog that isn't going to make it to spring. "Gideon, I've been meaning to come by. There's a buyer in Fort Macleod who's expressed interest. Good offer, given current conditions. It might be worth hearing out." "I'm not looking to sell," Gideon said. No, of course. Just keeping your options open. Times are hard. Nothing wrong with knowing what the land would bring." He smiled. The offer's there if circumstances change. After he left, Sylvie and Gideon stood in the yard watching his horse disappear down the road. He's been saying that for 2 years, Gideon said quietly. Circumstances change. Options open. Always the same careful language. He has a buyer ready. Yet that means he's been arranging this longer than the last 2 years. Gideon looked at her. His face was doing the thing it did when he was working through something he didn't want to arrive at. How long? I don't know yet. But long enough to have a buyer standing by. She turned back toward the house. The letter to Calgary should get an answer by end of the week. The answer came in 6 days. Theodore Birch, the Calgary buyer, had done business with Gideon's father and with Gideon himself for nearly a decade. He'd stopped buying from the Holt Ranch 2 years ago, when Schofield had written to him. On Gideon's behalf, Birch had assumed, saying that the herd was in poor condition due to Gideon's difficulties managing since his wife's illness, and that he was reducing his operation. Schofield had offered to supply him directly from his own contacts at better prices. Birch had believed it because he'd had no reason not to. He wrote now with what read like genuine regret. If he'd known the situation, he would never have switched suppliers. The cattle he'd bought through Schofield's contacts had been middling at best. Gideon read the letter twice. He handed it to Sylvie without a word. She read it and put it on the table between them. Pat outside, with the chickens, out of earshot. He lied to your buyer, Sylvie said. Told him you were struggling and unreliable, and then took the contract himself, while being very helpful and very concerned. Gideon's voice was flat and cold in the way of things held at enormous control. That's how it works. She kept her voice even. He made himself necessary while making sure you'd fail. And when you were desperate enough, he'd have a buyer already arranged, and he'd get the land at a reduced price. She looked at him. How much of the ranch borders his property? Gideon was quiet for a moment. The whole western edge, he said. He's been trying to push his operation through this valley for years. My land's the only section blocking him from the grazing rights on the provincial land to the north. Sylvie thought of the map Schofield probably had pinned to a wall somewhere. The Holt Ranch, a neat blank space in a route he'd been planning for a decade. It's not about the land alone, she said. It's about the access. Yeah. Gideon pushed back from the table. He stood with his hands on the chair back and stared at the window and the dark yard beyond it. I need a minute. She left him to it. When she came back downstairs 20 minutes later, he was at the kitchen table with a sheet of paper in front of him and a pen in his hand, but nothing written yet. I want to take this to Sheriff Crane, he said. The letter from Birch, the ledger, all of it. Good. He'll tell me it's circumstantial. Maybe. But it's enough to make him look, and once someone starts looking at Schofield with clear eyes, they'll find more. She sat down across from him. Write a full account. Dates, amounts, every name you can remember from every transaction that went through him. Make it hard to ignore. What if he ignores it anyway? Sylvie looked at him steadily. Then we find what he can't ignore. She found it the following week. She'd taken to walking the property boundaries in the evenings, partly to think, and partly because she'd grown genuinely fond of the land. In the way that crept up on you in this country, the way the light came off the hills at dusk, in long copper angles. She was following the western fence line when she found the gate. It wasn't on Gideon's survey map. It was in a section of fence she'd noted as needing post replacement, easy to miss in the scrub brush, but when she looked closely, she could see the hinges were new, recently installed. She knelt and looked at the ground on the other side. Tracks, coming from Schofield's property, passing through, heading toward the north grazing land. Recent enough that rain hadn't softened the edges. She didn't touch anything. She walked back to the house and told Gideon. He came with her, and they stood looking at the gate in the last of the evening light. He's been moving cattle through, Gideon said. Seems so, using my land without permission or payment. His jaw was working. For how long? Long enough to put in a proper gate. They went back to the house. Pat was doing schoolwork at the table and looked up at their faces and said nothing, which was its own kind of understanding. Write to Sheriff Crane tonight, Sylvie said. Tell him about the gate. Don't wait. He'll need to see it before Schofield can remove it. I know. Tonight. Gideon wrote the letter. And while he wrote, Sylvie sat across the table and thought about the shape of what Schofield was doing, the layers of it, how every piece had a reasonable explanation alone, but together they told a clear story. This was what she'd grown up watching. Her father's neighbor had done something similar with water rights, slow and incremental and always polite, until one day the thing that had been theirs no longer was. She had learned early how to read that kind of patience. The next morning, Schofield came back. Sylvie saw him coming from the garden and stayed where she was, close enough to hear. He was more direct this time, less of the careful warmth. Gideon, he said, dismounting, I understand you've been asking questions, writing to old buyers. Keeping up business relationships, Gideon said from the porch. Of course, of course. A pause. I also understand you've been going through old accounts. That's your right, naturally. But I'd hate for old records to create confusion where there isn't any. Business was complicated during Meredith's illness. I did what I could to help. If the numbers look irregular, it's because the times were irregular. They look more than irregular. Schofield's pleasant expression stayed in place, but something underneath it shifted. A tightening barely visible, the expression of a man whose plan had required more time. I think you're under a great deal of strain, Gideon. Understandable. A new arrangement at the ranch, financial pressure, Pat to look after alone. It's a lot. I worry about you. I'm fine. Are you? Schofield glanced at Sylvie, still in the garden with her hands in the dirt. New people sometimes encourage perspectives that aren't in your best interest. I'd hate to see a stranger use your situation for her own purposes. Sylvie straightened and looked at him directly. Schofield met her eyes. In his was the cool assessment of a man who decided she was an obstacle of a manageable size. She's not a stranger, Gideon said. She works here, of course. The pleasant tone back seamless. I just think a fresh accounting by a neutral party might resolve this. I'm happy to open my own books. Full transparency. I'll be in touch, Gideon said. After Schofield rode off, Gideon came down from the porch and stood next to Sylvie in the garden. He knows we're looking, he said. Yes, he'll move fast now, faster than we want him to. She looked down the road where the dust from his horse was settling. We need the sheriff to see that gate before it disappears. Crane is coming Thursday? That might be too long, Gideon thought. I'll ride to town today. Ask him to come sooner. He paused. Will you stay here with Pat? Yes. He looked at her for a moment. It was the same look he'd had the night they'd gone through the ledger. Something careful and considered, as if he was recalculating something he'd thought he understood. Why are you doing this? He said. This isn't what I hired you for. It's not. This isn't your fight. Sylvie thought of her father's land. Her mother's coat. The long drive west with $6 in a bag that wasn't heavy enough. It is now, she said. And besides, I don't like watching someone take what doesn't belong to them. I've seen how that ends. Gideon nodded, and then, unexpectedly, quietly, thank you, he rode to town. Pat came out and stood next to Sylvie in the garden. Is Schofield bad? Pat asked. Yes, I never liked him. Pat said it with the simple certainty of a child whose judgment had been right all along. He always looks at Papa like Papa owes him something. Sylvie looked down at her. You're a good judge of people, Pat. Mama said I was. A pause. She said Papa is too, but he doesn't always listen to it. He's listening now. Sheriff Crane came the following morning, a practical man in his 60s, who listened to everything Gideon laid out with the ledgers, and the birch letter spread on the kitchen table, then rode out to see the gate without being asked. He stood looking at it for a long time. That's new installation, he said. Yes, and those tracks are recent, within the last 2 weeks. Crane looked at the ground, at the fence, at the line of trees that marked Schofield's property. Douglas Schofield's been in this territory a long time, he said carefully. He is standing. I know that, Gideon said. I'm not saying that changes what this looks like. I'm saying I need to do this right, so it sticks. Crane looked at him. You have the ledgers? You have the birch letter. You have this gate. He paused. Is there anything else? Anyone else who can corroborate what Schofield was doing with your contracts? Sylvie thought about the supply orders, the equipment repairs. There will be, she said. If you contact the feed supplier in Pincher Creek and ask what they were actually charging other ranchers at the same time, it won't match what Schofield billed this ranch. Crane looked at her. And you're Sylvie Marchand. I keep the accounts. She's right, Gideon said. Check the feed prices. Crane checked, and the prices didn't match. Schofield had been billing the Holt Ranch at nearly double what other ranchers in the same area were paying the same supplier. The supplier, confronted with the discrepancy, produced records showing Schofield had taken a direct commission on the inflated difference. It had been happening for 3 years. It wasn't everything, but it was enough to pull at the thread until more came loose. 2 weeks later, a man named Gilbert Pierce, who'd worked for Schofield for 4 years, came to the ranch and asked to speak with Gideon. He was a quiet, weathered man who'd spent those years doing things he'd known weren't right, and he was tired of the weight of it. He sat at the kitchen table and told them about the gate. He'd helped build it 2 months ago, and about cattle driven through it at night, and about the letter Schofield had sent to a land broker in Calgary with a confidential offer to sell the Holt property that he'd had no right to make. Why are you telling us this? Sylvie asked. Because my sister's husband works for the man Schofield's planning to sell this place to, Pierce said. And last week he told her the sale's nearly settled, that the rancher's going to take an offer by Christmas. He looked at Gideon. I thought you should know. Gideon's hands on the table were very still. He's been arranging the sale while I'm still living here. Yes. How long has the sale been arranged? Pierce was quiet for a moment. The broker's been involved since last spring. Sylvie did the arithmetic. Since before Gideon had hired her. Since before there had been any reason for Schofield to feel rushed. He'd thought the outcome was already settled, and the ranch was already functionally his. She'd complicated that plan simply by arriving and being someone who looked at numbers clearly. Will you testify? Gideon said. Pierce nodded. If you need it, I'd like work on the other side of this, if you have anything. He looked at his hands. I know what I did. I'd like to do different. Gideon looked at Sylvie. She gave a small nod. You helped build that gate, Gideon said. You can help take it down. And after that, we'll talk about what else there is. The case moved through official channels over the following weeks, methodically, imperfectly, in the way of frontier justice that had no appetite for speed, but could be made to move with enough evidence and the right push. Crane filed with the territorial court. Birch gave a written statement. Pierce testified. The feed supplier's records were subpoenaed. Douglas Schofield hired the best lawyer available from Calgary and put on the face of a man deeply wounded by false accusations. His lawyer was skilled, and there were moments in those weeks where Sylvie could see the shape of how things might go wrong, the way wealth and standing could make a complicated truth look like paranoia. But the gate was photographed before it was removed. The cattle tracks were documented. The commission payments existed in writing. And Pierce, nervous but steady on the stand, told his story without wavering. Schofield was found liable on 4 counts: fraudulent billing, trespass, conversion of property, and interference with commercial contracts. The criminal charges were harder to make stick entirely, but the civil judgment meant enough of his assets were seized that the buyer in Calgary lost interest. Without control of the land access, the deal was worthless. He left the territory the following spring. Quietly, the way people leave when the story they've built about themselves has been taken apart in public. The morning after the verdict, Gideon and Sylvie sat on the porch in the cold, early light with cups of tea going warm in their hands. It's over, Gideon said. It is. I keep thinking there's something else coming. There's not. That's what over feels like when you've been waiting for the next bad thing for long enough. She looked out at the valley, the hills still blue in the early light, the first snow of the season, dusting the high ridges. It takes a while to believe it. He was quiet for a moment. I owe you an apology, he said. She looked at him. For what? For the way I was when you arrived. The letter I sent. I wasn't welcoming. I wanted help, but I didn't know how to let anyone in. He turned his cup in his hands. I'd spent 3 years making sure nothing else could be taken by not letting anything close enough to be taken. I know you know. That's why I'm saying it. He looked at her directly. You didn't have to do any of this. You came here for honest work and room and board. What happened after? I'm grateful. More than I know how to say properly. Sylvie thought about what she'd said the first week, the letter with its 11 lines, the drive through the foothills in the wagon, with a man she didn't know not saying a word. She thought about how the worst arrivals sometimes turned into the thing you'd been heading toward all along without knowing. You were honest with me, she said, from the first letter. You told me the ranch was struggling. You told me Pat didn't trust easily. You told me you didn't have intentions beyond the practical. She paused. There are people who would have hidden all of that to get what they needed. You didn't. That's not a small thing. He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, Pat's voice floated from the barn, talking to one of the horses the way she did when she thought no one was listening, low and serious and kind. I didn't expect you, Gideon said quietly. I put an advertisement in the paper because I needed someone to keep Pat from being alone and the stove from going cold. I didn't expect. He stopped. Someone who looked at this place like it was worth something. It is worth something. It's a lot of debt and a leaking barn roof. It's 300 acres of the most beautiful country I've ever seen, and a daughter who talks to horses and reads at the dinner table. That's worth something. She felt her voice go quiet. I didn't have anywhere to go when I came here. I thought I was just getting through the winter.
She looked at the hills.
But somewhere along the way, I stopped thinking about what comes next and started thinking about here. He was very still. Gideon. She hadn't called him by his first name before. Always Holt, the way you called an employer when you were keeping your distance. It felt different in her mouth. I'm not going to say something that makes this strange between us if you don't want it. I know what the letter said. I know what the arrangement was. The arrangement, he said slowly, is not what this is anymore. She looked at him. I don't know how to do this properly, he said. It was the most uncertain she'd ever heard him sound. I haven't. Since Meredith, I closed all of that off. I told myself it was for Pat. Mostly it was for me, because losing someone that way, watching it take so long, I didn't. He stopped, tried again. But you were here. Every morning and every supper and every evening when you sat at that table and went through the numbers like you were determined to make sense of everything I'd given up trying to understand. And I started looking forward to those evenings. A pause. More than I had any right to. Sylvie set down her cup. You have every right. He looked at her hands, reached over and covered one with his, the way he did things, slowly, carefully, making sure it was wanted. I'm not easy to know, he said. No, but I'm not looking for easy. She turned her hand over in his. I've had easy. It didn't hold. That winter they fixed the barn roof. Gideon and Pierce, who'd stayed on as he'd asked, and a neighbor from 2 valleys over who came with lumber and 2 strong sons and stayed for supper after. The house was louder than it had been. Pat taught Sylvie which chickens would take food from your hand and which ones would never forgive you for trying. On Sundays they made biscuits together, all 3 of them, flour on every surface, and the first week Pat declared them adequate, which was high praise, and the second week she ate 3 and didn't say anything at all, which was higher. The cattle were in better condition by spring. The drainage ditch was cleared and the north pasture was usable again. Birch wrote from Calgary to say he'd be interested in renewing their contract for the coming season. Gideon wrote back yes. One evening in March, when the snow was beginning to pull back from the south-facing slopes and the hills were showing the first pale stubble of green, Sylvie was at the kitchen table going through the accounts. Her own ledger now, properly organized, nothing in it she couldn't explain in plain language, when Pat came and sat across from her. Are you going to stay? Pat asked. Sylvie looked up. I'm planning on it. For how long? She thought about it honestly. For as long as you'll have me. Pat looked at the table, at the ledger, at Sylvie's hands on the pen. Papa smiles more, she said. Not big, but more than before. I've noticed. Mama used to say the problem with Papa is that he was always better at showing things than saying them. She said you had to watch his hands. Pat looked at Sylvie directly. He fixed your side of the fence first, after the storm last month. His side was worse, but he fixed yours first. Sylvie had noticed that too. I know, she said quietly. Pat nodded, satisfied, and went back to her book. Gideon came in from the barn 20 minutes later, stamping mud from his boots, and looked at Sylvie at the table with the evening lamplight on her face. He didn't say anything. But his hands, when he poured 2 cups of tea and set one in front of her without being asked, were steady and certain in the way of a man who had decided something, and was no longer afraid of the decision. She wrapped both her hands around the cup and felt the warmth of it, and thought that this ordinary, imperfect, hard-won quiet was what she'd been looking for without knowing she was looking. Outside, the hills were dark against a sky going deep blue toward full night. The ranch sat in the valley like something that had been waiting, not for rescue, just for the people in it to stop fighting long enough to look up and see what they had. That was enough. That was, she thought, everything.